So it's great to be here, so thank you to all. We've seen that according to the traditional Gricean picture, infants are supposed to have a high degree of intentional control over their communicative behavior. And so there is an important sense according to which, in which infants, when they communicate successfully, they know what they're doing. But what I will argue now is in favor of a shift in perspective, which makes sense of the idea that infants, in fact, need not know what they're doing when they communicate with others, or at least need not know what they're doing in advance of becoming competent communicators. So to operate this shift in perspective, I need to adopt an alternative view of linguistic communication. So I can accept that intention recognition and reasoning about intentions and beliefs are, ubiquitous in mature adult human communication, but it's not the most fundamental forms of communication, or at least linguistic communication is primarily for something more basic. And it's, in agreement with others, I adopt a commitment-based view of linguistic communication, according to which linguistic communication is primarily for sharing commitments. So we coordinate activities, and that's something that we need to do all of the time, and to do so reliably and for extended periods of time, we need to be able to rely on each other. And to manage our expectations about each other's behavior, we undertake commitments. And so, on this view, the building blocks of human communication are speech acts. And speech acts are primarily for sharing commitments. So the idea, to make this a little more concrete, if I promise Nima that I will prepare pizza tomorrow, I thereby commit myself to Nima to preparing pizza tomorrow. And what this means is that, for instance, Nima is entitled to reprimand me should I fail to prepare pizza tomorrow. And it also entails that I must be prepared to take all the necessary steps to, in fact, prepare the pizza for tomorrow. Now, an important feature of commitment, at least in the framework I'm adopting, which is the one by Bart Hertz, is that they are relational structures. So I always undertake a commitment to somebody to act in accordance with a certain proposition. For instance, that I will prepare pizza tomorrow. But the important fact is that this commitment comes to hold only if both I and Nima also accept it. So if Nima were to say, dude, your pizza is terrible, you should rather bring the beers, then my commitment to prepare pizza tomorrow to Nima just doesn't hold, right? Because he hasn't ratified it. So, speech acts are for sharing commitments, and commitments are in fact in place only when it is accepted by both parties that they are in place. Where acceptance may just be, not objecting to somebody. It doesn't need to be something that you actively do. But since commitments are social relationships between consenting parties, then we need acceptance from both, even if it's just implicit. And I'm simplifying very wildly here, but let's just assume that if the commitment is mutually accepted, then, we both have it toward each other to act consistently with the proposition, and we can say that this commitment has become common ground for us. And by common ground, here I just mean the sets of commitments which are in fact shared. Now, the last important bit of the framework that I need to introduce is that the notion of commitment as a normative one is closed under entailment. And what this means is that if you commit yourself to the proposition that P and P entails Q, then you also commit yourself to Q. Even if you never considered this entailment before, and even if you never entertained the possibility that P. Now, more generally, so why is it plausible to think that normative notions like commitments are closed under entailment? Well, because more generally, you can undertake commitments unknowingly or unwittingly. So without knowing exactly what the kind of commitments you have incurred to, and without exactly intending to undertake those commitments. And this can be out of all sorts of circumstances. So I might, foolishly sign up for a PhD in philosophy, not quite understanding that in a 4 years' time I will have to hand in a thesis. Well, my commitment to, in fact, hand in a thesis in 4 years' time persists despite my ignorance. So, if linguistic communication is primarily a matter of sharing commitment, what is pre-linguistic communication? Well, the idea clearly is that in communicating pre-linguistically, like children gradually get more and more prepared to share commitments. So, and the adoption of a commitment-based framework gives us hints on what are the steps that infants must take to, in fact, become able to share commitments in linguistic communication later on. So we saw that mutual acceptance is a prerequisite, and so infants at some point must develop an ability to, know how to signal and recognize the acceptance and rejection of candidate commitments. And, well, I don't have time to expand on the details, but if one considers signals such as head shakes and nodding for rejection and acceptance of candidate commitments, one can see the kind of reliable use of these conventional gestures, emerging relatively late, let's say from 1.5 years, 2 years of age. But the thing is that infants, are highly motivated to participate in interaction with others, and they have a strong preferences for several kinds of contingent responsivity. And the reality is that even if they haven't yet mastered conventional signals for acceptance and rejection, they do have many means of accepting and rejecting what the other is trying to do or to convey, as in pushing away or anticipating actions and so on and so forth. So there's a good sense in which infants, from at least when they are around 1.5 years of age, do know how to signal and recognize the acceptance and rejection of candidate commitments. And then, so if it has to make sense that infants do in fact deal with commitments, even if they're not yet able to think about commitments, then they must have some degree of competence in those joint activities which are regulated by the commitment, right? So, like a fairly trivial example is the game of giving objects. Now, it has a structure such as, the kid offers an object and monitors for the acceptance of the other accepts, and then the infant does in fact give the object. And we know that from when they are around 1 year of age, they are masters at this game, because sometimes they also tease the adult. So they play with the kind of normative expectations that the adult in fact has, for instance by withdrawing the cookie. And then finally, commitment is a normative notion, and so for a commitment to in fact be in place, we must be disposed to behave normatively toward each other, so to, let's say, sanction its violations in various ways. And there is recent evidence that, well, for all we can see, from when they are 1.5 years of age, infants do have some dispositions to correct some others, which in fact fail to behave in accordance with a commitment that has been shared. Now let me make this concrete and show how to make sense of the idea that infants need not know in advance what they're doing. So let me just recapitulate an important experiment done by Grosse and colleagues in 2010 about repairing attempts. So in that experiment, the adult and the infant play several games, which it consists, for instance, in having a toy elephant and putting 4 toy shoes on the elephant. And then the last, and for each shoes, the adult, gives it to the infant, say, oh, where does this go, and so on and so forth. For the last shoe, the adult seems to be distracted, and the infant is encouraged to either point to the last piece of the game or to request it in some way. So in the adult is holding the last piece of the game in her right hand, and there's a distractor object on a shelf on the left-hand side of the adult. And so in one condition, the infant requests the last piece, and the adult just hands it to the infant, as she normally would. And in the other, the adult pretends to misunderstand the infant. So she says, the infant points to the ball or says ball, and the adult, instead of giving the ball to the infant, turns to the left and say, oh, you want this, and then does not give anything to the infant, but rather makes the ball available for the infant on the table, right? So how to interpret these results? Well, if you adopt like a traditional Gricean perspective, you might think that, okay, you see, in this lucky accident condition, happy accident condition, the child got what she wanted by luck, but repeated the request nonetheless. So this is supposed to be evidence that the child didn't just intend the adult to give the child the object, but the child also intended the adult to recognize that the child intended the adult to give her the object. And as natural as this interpretation might sound, I hold that in one sense it glosses over the complexity of infant communication, while at the same time being unnecessary. So one might say, look, here the adult has signaled the acceptance of a request that the child has never issued. So, and this is a first violation of expectation. Then does not satisfy the request to which she consented, right? Because the distractor object remains on the shelf, and in the end never gives any object to the child. So the child is, by everybody's standards, expected to be confused on several levels. And so we see that, half of the younger children, I mean, we're talking about 18-month-olds, sorry if I didn't say this before, they repeat their request, which they are expected to do, also in a commitment sharing framework. So, in giving this alternative interpretation, I didn't mention communicative intentions. And in fact, I showed elsewhere that you can generalize this interpretive strategy to any such experiment, so that whenever an explanation in terms of communicative intentions seems to be available, there is a better explanation in terms of commitment sharing, from which it doesn't follow that the infant deals with communicative intentions. And so, in an important sense, there is no developmental challenge, because the very notion of communicative intention is explanatorily dispensable. Now you can feel free to hate me. Okay.
All right, time for questions.
Hi. Hey, okay. Thank you for the talk. It's very interesting. One thing that I would like to hear more about, it's still not obvious to me. Is okay? So thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. Okay. Is that okay? Okay, sorry. So one thing that I would like to hear more about is in which sense the notion of acceptance will result in a counter communication that is more simple than the notion of intention. and so that we reduce the challenge for development. I really don't see as a normative notion the required generated expectation about the future that might have, you know, I really don't see it, or at least, let me put it less negatively, but how is this going to make communication simpler to explain?
So, no, communication itself remains a very complex affair. It's just that this is a theory of communication per se, and not of another theory of processing, right? So you can share commitment without knowing what you're doing, right? Although, you know, if you infringe them, you will be called to task. But you might not know what you're doing. So one thing is complexity as something that pertains to processing, what's going on in your head. And a different thing is the kind of logic that communication has, whether or not you know that it does. And from the point of view, the logic of communication remains highly complex. It's just that you can start playing the game even if your mechanisms are still rather simple or untrained. But this doesn't entail, you know, this proposal is silent on cognitive mechanisms.
Is silent, but you still need to understand what is a commitment and behave accordingly and coordinate with other people. So it could be silent up to a certain point. And I think that on the other hand, also communication and intention might be silent. There might be different degree of awareness and you know, about what are your intention and what are the intention of other people.
Yes, so it's the thing is, you do not need to have the concept of commitment at all before you start sharing commitments with others. And you do not need to have neither the concepts that constitute the content of the commitment. You don't need to entertain a thought with the same content. Now you say, obviously, to share commitment meaningfully, there must be a minimal degree of competence in participating to the joint activity. And I fully agree with that. And that's why I said, well, there are some joint activities in which infants are already, even young infants are already competent participants. So, and you say, okay, but that denotes like a certain cognitive complexity in the infant. And I say, sure, I mean, I'm fine with that. It's just that it will be explanatorily idle to suppose that that cognitive complexity is mastery of Gricean communicative intentions. So that's the road I block. Everything else is fine by me, of what you said. But thank you a lot.
Okay. There was one question in the back.
Hello. Yeah. Hi. Since my studies were cited so much, I thought I should say something. Well, actually, the study was entitled "Wanting to be Understood." And I think wanting to be understood is different than intending the other to know that I intend them to know. So, proposedly, we hear only mentioned a low-level understanding and not a multi-level meta-representational process.
Yes, may I clarify something? Just, I didn't say the Gricean is the interpretation put forward by the authors.
Okay,
it's
but
the interpretation.
Stay on this slide, maybe, because I have a question actually
Sure.
regarding this phrasing of yours here. Acceptance of a different request without satisfying it. So, in your terms, this is now labeled a commitment, right?
Yeah.
A request.
I mean, no, because the common ground is defective. So there is an act of acceptance that misfires, because in fact that was not the request put forward.
Sure, but the child would have still to know that what is the request which we're talking about, right?
The child
know whether this is satisfied or not.
Yeah. I mean, the child needs to issue the request and have some expectations on what counts as satisfying it. Yeah, sure.
And how is this different from understanding? So how is a commitment in your terms different from understanding communication? That's what I don't really get now, just quickly from this 15-minute talk.
So, of course, if you issue a certain request and you have the right sort of expectations on what counts as satisfying the request, that counts as a minimal degree of understanding. The thing is that you can have this minimal degree of understanding without thinking that a commitment had been shared, right? Even though that would have been the case in the normal case. So I think that commitment sharing is indeed conducive to understanding, because the normative pressure makes it the case that you will become better over time, a better communicator over time. But you don't need to start with the concept of commitment or of any of the concept involved in the content of the commitment.
So what do you start with then?
Plenty of things, like all the things that fall into the, abilities and knowledge that I appeal to in giving the story about giving objects and teasing and so on. It's vast, I mean.
Okay, thank you very much.
But sorry if I wasn't clear that
Yeah.
Gricean and normativist are not the interpretations discussed by the authors of the experiment, but are interpretations that have been given very often in the literature. So thanks for giving me the occasion to clarify that.
Thank you.